So our last talk of the morning will be by Spencer Hardy. Again, somebody else who wears many hats. He's the lead coordinator of the bee team at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, where he's worked on Vermont Bumblebee Atlas. He also co-owns the farm upstream in Jericho, where he grows native plants, including trees, as well as berries and other fruit. Has been an active member in the Native Tree Nursery Roundtable. And his talk today will put his interest in bees and his interest in trees together. And it's entitled Bees in the Trees.
As Sean said, I'm coming at this from a couple different angles. But basically, Sean wanted me to come here and talk to you about how you can make riparian plantings beneficial for pollinators. And the short answer is keep doing what you're doing. Bees like trees, it turns out. Some of you probably recognize a few of those flowers, chokecherry, dogwood, and rhodora. Bees are the pollinators that get all the attention, but they're basically just picky vegetarian wasps. It's a small subset of the pollinators on the landscape. Maybe some of the more efficient ones in most of our systems, and certainly the most fundable. So I'm talking about bees primarily, but a lot of this will apply to other taxa as well. Couple fun examples here. This is a geranium miner. It's a specialist bee that only collects pollen from wild geranium. So you only find it for the 2 weeks in May when the wild geranium is blooming in the Champlain Hills. Can't find it anywhere else. It's further south, obviously, the rest of the country, but in Vermont, that's where it is and when you find it. This one here, this is the ground cherry fairy bee. It's a tiny 3 millimeter little black bee that you only find where you have ground cherries and tomatillos growing in sandy sites. It needs sand for nesting and being a ground nester, and as you all know, it's a lot easier to dig in sand than it is in clay. A lot of the bees figured this out a long time ago. Our best, highest bee diversity sites are those with nice, well-drained sandy soils. And this one needs this plant, or this genus of plants, to collect pollen for the next generation. This guy up here, this is a generalist. So this one will be out all summer visiting any number of flowers, but it needs rotting logs to nest in. So it's limited by that. And I could go on and on and on for 352 different stories. But I'm going to focus on the plants and the particularly woody plants that people can and already are planting in riparian areas for many functions, but with the pollinator angle. Some of my favorites here. American chestnut maybe is not one that's planted regularly, but there's a specialist bee, a species of mining bee that is only known to visit chestnut flowers, and obviously is not doing great at the moment, but has been found in some chestnut orchards in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and was certainly in Vermont prior to chestnut blight. We plant enough chestnuts, maybe that bee will come back into the state. And it's also a great midsummer blooming flower en masse. A mature chestnut tree would have thousands and thousands of flowers and be covered in bumblebees and a number of other bees. A lot of our trees, as you all know, are spring blooming. So it's a nice resource before a lot of the forbs get going. But then in a forested landscape, it's really nice and valuable to have these summer blooming trees scattered throughout, where you think of a mature hardwood forest, there's a great flush of spring ephemerals and maples blooming, and then there's really little in terms of flower resources in a closed canopy until maybe in the fall there's a few goldenrods that try to sneak through. But things like basswood and chestnut provide a floral resource in a closed canopy at a time when there's very little else going on. Black gum, also maybe sort of borderline for Vermont, but apparently, and I haven't confirmed this myself in the state, but apparently is a great pollinator plant, and there's a lot of bees that are associated with that one. A lot of the shrubs are all familiar to folks. I'd put a question out there, if anyone's ever tried pin cherry. It's not one I have a lot of experience with, but is a nice early successional pollinator plant. I don't know how much the deer like it. I know chokecherry has been popular with planting groups. Oh, and then, the plants that are in bold are ones that have specialist bees that only collect pollen from that group. There's something like 6 species of bees that only collect pollen from willows. There's 4 that only visit dogwoods. So having this you plant all willows, you're not going to get all the species. You have to add all these other ones to get the species that are attached to certain plants. And this is one of my personal favorites at the moment. It shows up on some planting lists. Wasn't really on my radar until a few years ago when I realized that there was a bee, in this case the sandbar willow fairy bee, that is only known from sandbar willow. If folks are familiar with it, it's a willow. It's kind of like all the other shrub willows, except that it blooms on new wood in May, June, and through most of July. So all of our other willows are done blooming late May, the latest. But then that's when sandbar willow really gets going. And this is a summer active bee that is just totally cued into that sandbar willow, and especially the male plants, which is where all the pollen's coming from, that they're using to feed their offspring. So there's maybe 2 specialist bees. It does well in dry sites. It's a riparian species of sort of like gravel bars that are scoured out. But I've been planting it now for a few years in really dry, sandy sites in a couple places, and it seems to do much better than other willows there. And when I went to dig them last spring, I realized it's because it's got a gnarly taproot. A lot of the other willows have really long roots that seem to go out to the side and are a pain to dig, but this one in particular just sends a single root straight down and maybe limits its ability to be grown and transplanted, but also allows it to access water resources that other willows aren't tapping into necessarily. And I've also heard concern some planting groups are limited by planting rare species up through S3. I checked, and sandbar willow's S3, S4, so maybe if you round the other way, you can include it, but not a super common species on the landscape, although maybe overlooked in that it's easy to miss unless you're looking for the flower and the bees. Another one that I think is maybe a little bit, at least in some circles, is a little contentious, but I really like staghorn sumac as a pollinator plant. We think of it as the red berries in the fall, but it's got a abundant flower in sort of that June, July period when there's a dearth of other native plants on the land, flowering on the landscape. There's a specialist bee, not that one in the picture, but it's fast growing, it spreads, it suckers, it's about as deer resistant as I can think of from what I've seen, but maybe others have other take on that. And it provides nesting sites. So far I've been talking about pollinators from the pollen and the flower perspective, but they also need a place to live. 82% or something, or 78% are nesting in the soil. Not a lot we can do about that, but bare, sandy soil and collapsing riverbanks are a great place to find nesting bees. But also nesting in wood, and then there's maybe 10% that are nesting in above ground stems, so dead woody stems from the year before, or from cavities in standing snags, firewood with 5/16 holes drilled in it is a great way to attract bees to anywhere you've got stack of wood. But something to think about when we're selecting our plants, including herbaceous things, which I'll talk about in a second, but there's several woody species listed here, and maybe probably others that have hollow stems. You cut into a sumac and you see that white pith all the way through the middle, or an elderberry, and there's a bunch of bees that are really good at excavating that, and that's where they nest, and then that's where they overwinter for the following year. And especially in parts of the Champlain Valley where the soils are hard clay, a significant proportion of our bee fauna is found in these above ground nesting sites. Native bunch grasses, I think I put on there just as a place where there's some bumblebees that'll nest in the thatch above ground. They'll make a little tent of grasses, and the native blue stems are particularly valuable for that, apparently. And then a study from Britain, but I think would apply here as well, that excess fertility has been shown to negatively impact bee diversity, and I think that's largely through thick herbaceous sod layers that prevent species from accessing the soil for ground nesting. So thinking cornfields that turn into reed canary or into clover or something else, and maybe hard for the bees to get into, but in a sort of a maybe a more natural or a scoured riverbank where there's sparser, drier vegetation, you'll have a lot more bee nesting. So not a lot that, I said there's not a lot that planting groups can do, but one thing I think that to keep in the back of your mind is as you visit sites, look for places where there's exposed sand or where there's thin vegetation and the native soil is visible, and often you'll see bees going in and out of there with pollen, or you'll see little, what look like anthills, but the opening's the size of a pea instead of the size of an ant. And you can find, often there's a small area, 10 square meters, where most of the bee activity for a site is happening, and just something to be cognizant of if you're trying to either protect those or to stabilize those, maybe not plant a thick forest right on top of them. And then another place for strategic woody additions, drop a big stump and come back in 3 years, and I suspect there'll be 3 or 4 species of bees nesting in it, as well as all kinds of other insect diversity. Drilling holes in snags is a quick way to get some bee diversity under a landscape. Certainly just for fun, not something that would be fundable. And then I'll just talk for a minute about perennials. This is sort of edge of my expertise, and I think it's something that people have expressed interest in the planting world, and there's movement in that direction. My understanding is it's hard to fund with current funding mechanisms that are tied to water quality. I'd be curious to hear if people have ideas or interest. And then there's a lot, unlike the woody world where we're starting to have some local adapted, local ecotypes of seed, it's nearly impossible to find local ecotypes of all but a few species of perennial herbaceous things. And that may change. There's some grant projects underway to develop that pipeline, but right now we're limited, basically, especially at conservation scale and cost, we're limited to seed mixes from the Midwest of sort of prairie species that may or may not be the best choices for our sites. Some of my favorites here, again, the bold species have specialist bees, and thinking about putting in plugs or even bare root, some of these species do well. Transplant suckers and rhizomes and orchid be potted and planted in midsummer. Certainly expensive, but maybe a way to add a little bit of diversity to a site. And then direct seeding. Lots of people have tried. Generally what I hear is that it just doesn't work, or that it's really hard to get a good establishment of the species that you want. Some of these seeds take 2 or 3 years of dormancy before they germinate. There's seed mixes that you can plant that are sort of the Midwest prairie species that people have selected for rapid growth and establishment. But then maybe they get outcompeted by invasive grasses or goldenrods or other things that, because we're not a prairie state. But a few of my favorites that I think would be interesting to try if there was funding to do a broadcast seeding, especially bare soils, as people have mentioned, and or mixed in with a cover crop, where maybe you go in August, you herbicide, or you're in an old cornfield and you apply, you spread a bunch of native seeds, and then maybe a fall cover of peas and oats or buckwheat or something that would then winter kill. The seeds cold stratify in place, and then that next spring you might get a little bit of establishment that way. And I'd love to hear from anyone that has had luck or failures or thought about doing this at scale in riparian situations. And before people answer, I'm just going to jump ahead to my last slide. Just shout out to the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. It's a network not dissimilar to this, focused on pollinator issues around the state. And there's a subset of the group that's trying to figure out how to get more pollinator habitat onto the landscape. And I know there's some overlap, and I've seen there's some folks here that are also in this picture, and I'd love to see more collaboration there. If people are interested, I can connect you, and we do a fall meeting and a summer sort of public celebration day, and we have a listserv now. And if people need lunch, it's almost lunchtime too, so I won't.
Thanks, Spencer. That was great. Two things. I'll just share that when we've been able to remove the grass layer, we have done some herbaceous seeding on sites with really good success. So a thumbs up for seeding if you can do it. We've put down seed in the fall, so it has that winter stratification, and then in the spring, we've had really good results.
Are there certain species that you've noticed have done well, or and I guess where have you gotten the seed mixes to? What have you used?
We've mostly used Ernst out of Pennsylvania, but they do some like more local genotypes. Yeah, obviously native species only, but I could send you a list. I guess off the top of my head, I don't have, the perfect list of what did well, but we've had good results. Second, just to say the staghorn sumac, I thought the same thing about deer resistance, and I'd love to hear other people in the room. Several years ago, I was like really excited about planting it, and it got demolished by deer. I don't know if it's like just when it's young, tender growth or something, but you would think, like the way you see it on the landscape, that it would be deer resistant, and I did not have that experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt I had the same thing, and I love it for a lot of reasons, but after planting some myself, transplanting in my yard in Montpelier, it got demolished. And I had to put fence around it to just keep it going. So that I wish it.
Okay.
We were excited about it at one point, but also on the Katie's also on some of our wet sites in particular we've just had great success, natural regen with the seed was just out there after we've taken out cool season grasses. We've had sites that have come in very well to boneset, Joe Pyeweed, blue vervain, asters. I mean, it's just out there, and you just got to get rid of that, really the cool season grass, clover mix that's, was a farm field. So we've had great success after doing, either boom spraying or spot spraying, even just like in those spots and having that seed that's there show up, or, it's already there, and really good success. So just changing that from grass to something that's not just grass has often been really successful. And, on the, even though it's nasty to walk through, the tear thumb had amazing amount of bees on it, just incredible. I mean, I swear you could like make tear thumb honey, because it was just loaded when we were out there. And then the Biden also, great amount of flowers. I don't know if it's as good, but for pollinator, I just remember being really impressed by.
Yeah, the whole smartweed genus has got a good number of at least generalist pollinators on it for sure, and Biden's as well. That's good to hear. I'm glad people have had some natural and planted success.
I know we talked about this a little, Spencer. I'm just curious if you can offer some advice or suggestions about the conundrum between like the benefit of brambles and roses and sort of those more aggressive species that benefit pollinators, and then like difficult of access and how they can actually inhibit other plants. It's just such a fine line in terms of like bee pollination. How do you navigate that? Thank you.
Yeah, so brambles and roses, and then I'll also add vines to that list. That I've seen a few people complaining about vine damage. But a lot of our native vines, Virginia creeper, grape, groundnut, are all pretty valuable pollinator plants. I guess where I come down is that the goal is to establish as close to the wild community as we can, so the trees should have priority. I think there's the brambles and the roses, I think, can get along well enough with trees, and if they were like in small quantities. And I've seen swamp rose growing nicely in mixed wet, old wet meadows among grasses and other woodies. And I don't know, I haven't followed the succession well enough to see if something like an aggressive blackberry is able to how it falls in the successional timeline, and if it provides a place where some of the woody species can get established underneath or not. Maybe it helps with prevent deer browse if it slows them down and sends them around the corner. They also love it in the late fall. Yeah.
Shout out on sandbar willow too. We started planting that on some of our fine sandy loam sites, and actually in a couple of clay. But does yeah, it's amazing. I didn't know about the fairy bee. That's really cool. So that's fun. So it is very tolerant of the drier sites, and it forms these nice thickets. I guess in some places it can be invasive, but anyway, it's very successful so far.
Cool. Yeah, I love it.
Larry, did you have, I was going to ask a question.
This is a great presentation. I had a question about that little like thread you threw in about like maybe process-based restoration, strategic wood addition could provide cool habitat for nesting bees. And I'm curious about just in general, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of variety with each species, but like how comfortable are they nesting in places that are like right by the water or in the water potentially? Like if you built a structure spanning a stream, would that be good habitat for bees to nest, or would it kind of?
That's a good question. I've seen plenty of good examples of nesting on banks, like actively eroding cut banks. I think stumps that are outside of the channel, or like if the butt of a big tree is sticking up onto the bank, I think that'd be totally fair game. Actually, and tree tip-ups, even in forests, are a really interesting site for nesting bees. And then I think what you're getting at is how they do with flooding and seasonal inundation. The only antidote that I have is that there's a long-term bee monitoring project going on in the Intervale, where some UVM folks have been collecting bees since like 2012, most summers, 3 or 4 times during the course of the season. Obviously, it was under 4 feet of water for 2 weeks, or for a week in July of 2023. But there were still bees there as soon as that water receded. I think the sample was from early September of 2023, and there was a similar bee community that you'd expect. And everything within the nesting area of those bees was probably underwater. So they're somewhat resilient. There are also, I think there's a few papers showing changes in bee communities after extensive flooding. There's some species that wrap their nests in a waterproof, like a cellophane wrapper, that do well in heavy, wet soils. And I think it probably depends a lot in terms of when in the season the flooding is happening. They probably do okay in the winter, but if they flooded midsummer, maybe there's other concerns.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
It sounds like you do worry about like where the seed source. I mean, if somebody were to be seeding a pollinator understory in their riparian plantings, that you would be concerned about where that seed is sourced. Just so it sounds like in some case, in one case at least, there's being sourced from Pennsylvania. I don't know where Vermont Wetland Supply. I know in some of the projects I've been involved with, that's where we got seeds. I don't know what the source for those are, but just curious to hear what you have to say about like if we don't have that seed source that's local available, should we use stuff from elsewhere?
Totally, yeah. And I actually meant to bring this up based on Carrie's talk. There's a very similar garden experiment going on with some colleagues at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. They planted 10 or 12 species of flowering perennials at different sites around the Upper Valley, and this will be the second season of monitoring pollinators and herbivores, so caterpillars, on these plants to see how the seed provenance affects the upstream trophic levels. And as far as I know, this hasn't really been done with pollinators before. But from year 1 of the study, there was some species, the phenology was significantly different, in that, and that has impacts for the pollinators, obviously, but especially for these specialist bees. So there was a Midwest, a Southern, and a Northeast ecotype, and the specialists overlapped best with the Northeast ecotype, as you'd expect. The other ones were flowering, had bees on them, but mostly it was generalist bees that have a that aren't as cued into the phenology of the host plant. So yes, I think it does matter for pollinators, probably species dependent, site dependent, bee dependent, but best practice would be local ecotypes. I don't think that there's very few, especially places selling seeds at scale. Northeast Seed Collective in Connecticut has some regional ecotypes. Where Wetland Supply gets their seeds, I think some of them are probably locally collected. And then how much does it matter in the grand scheme of things, especially if these are all sites that are going to be forested in 10 years, ideally. Maybe the goal is just to get some floral resources out there on the landscape to support the generalist bees to go off and then spread into the surrounding farm fields. But there's certainly concern about genetic swamping of the native species. A lot of the prairie species, one thing I'll add is that, yeah, a lot of the prairie species that we get in these Midwest prairie mixes are maybe Vermont native, but there's one or two remnant populations, and they're S1 or S2, and only exist in some of the rare sandplain communities. So I'm thinking of like spotted bee balm, horse mint. Some of these, Vermont's not a prairie state, and the state botanists are trying to telling people to avoid planting seeds of S1, S2 rare species so that they don't swamp the local genetics. So maybe you're better off planting a purple coneflower that's U.S. native but not Vermont native. I don't know. It's a rabbit hole we could go down at some other point.
Any other questions for Spencer?
Dave in the back.
Oh, wait in the back.
Just a real quick plug for local ecotype perennials. Van Berkham Nursery in New Hampshire is doing a lot with local ecotypes. I don't know if they're providing seed, but they do grow plugs. It's, again, probably not super cost effective, but just a resource for folks. They're really kind of forefront, I think, in growing the local ecotypes for perennials of the region.
Totally. And a quick shout out to Toby Schulman, who's been at some of these meetings in the past, who has an active grant now to create 6 or 10 seed increase plots of native ecotypes, local ecotypes of desirable species that someday will then make their way into the seed supply chain.
Oh, yeah. Northeast Seed Network, there's a northerly hub, which Toby is on as well, to get local ecotype bulk seed out for restoration projects. This involves both herbaceous and woody species. So that could be something coming down the pipeline, whether it's through seed increase plots or through wildly collected seed. So just plugging that.